Hello, and welcome to the launch of the IEA Special Report on Solar PV Global Supply Chains. I'm Jethro Mullen, Editor-in-Chief in the IEA's Communications team, and I'm joined here today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, and our Senior Energy Analyst, Hamy Bahar, the lead author of the new report. Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Mr. Bahar will present the key findings of the report. We'll then have time to take some questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, starting now. And with that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Many thanks, Mr. Mullen. Greetings from International Energy Agency headquarters. I would like to welcome the journalists and all the viewers around the world to this launch event for the IEA's first ever special report on solar PV industry. Dear colleagues, as International Energy Agency has indicated several months ago, we are in the middle of the first global energy crisis. In terms of its depth and complexity, the world has never faced such an energy crisis before. And when we look at the energy crisis where we are today, how the supply chains, energy supply chains work gets an additional importance. It is the reason, looking at the current energy crisis, looking at the supply chain disruptions occurred as a result of COVID-19 crisis, looking at the raw material price increases, and putting all of them together, raising major and sometimes strategic questions related to energy security, we thought it might be the time to look at the supply chain of one of the leading clean energy technologies such as solar PV. Now, when we look at the International Energy Agency's work, both short-term and the longer term, we are seeing a major growth of solar PV. Mainly, it is getting cheaper around the world, and many countries are providing strong support for solar PV. We thought, since there is such a growth, expectation of growth on solar PV, there may be a need to see how the manufacturing capacity evolves in the next years to come, and whether or not it evolves in a resilient way, in a sustainable way or not. So it is the reason I asked my colleague Mr. Bahar and his colleagues to put together a report to look at all the segments of the manufacturing industry, supply chain of solar PV, and I would like to thank him here and the team putting together breaking news for all of us when you look at the numbers. It's an excellent report, lots of detail you will see, and with major, in my view, conclusions. I am going to highlight, in my view, four important findings, key findings of the study, and Mr. Bahar will go to some of the details of those findings and beyond. First of all, China. We cannot talk about solar PV without mentioning China. Why? China has been instrumental to bring the cost of solar PV worldwide and providing multiple benefits to clean energy transitions around the world. And as a result of China's industrial policies, and mainly as a result of Chinese industrial policies, we have seen the cost of solar PV in the last decade decline by about 80%. So, of course, this is a very good news, but Chinese economy also benefited from that as a result of this industrial policy. And our estimation is, as of last year, 2021, the Chinese solar PV exports reached about 30 billion US dollars. And this makes about 7% of Chinese trade surplus. An important economic revenue generator for Chinese economy. Now, this is, of course, good news that the cost of solar comes down as a result of Chinese policies. Second, however, point I wanted to highlight, the extent of concentration in global supply chains also creates potential challenges going forward, especially in China. The report that Mr. Bahar and his team put together tells me that when you look at all the segments, about 80% today, about 80% of all the supply chain is dominated by China. And when we look at the manufacturing capacity under consideration, the projects, we look one by one, all of these projects, around 2025, this 80% may well be reaching 95% around the world. Putting China or another country aside, as an organization which has the energy security as a key mandate since years, we believe this level of concentration in any global supply chain would represent a significant vulnerability, and in my view, solar PV is no exception to that. So this is the second point I wanted to bring from our report. The third point, we not only analyze this situation today and in the future, we came up with some solutions, some suggestions how we can address these challenges. And here the magic word that we are suggesting to governments around the world, including Chinese government, the magic word is diversification. And we suggest that the diversification can offer multiple economic and environmental opportunities, and as such can reduce supply chain vulnerabilities. And as our report shows, creating substantial amount of solar PV manufacturing capacity in the countries can well bring new jobs, and our numbers show that the 500,000 new sustainable manufacturing jobs from solar PV can be created in the next 10 years to come. So it is a must, in my view, to diversify it. Otherwise, we may see major challenges in the days, months, and years ahead. Even for China, the very fact that one of the most important segments of the manufacturing capacity, about 40% in one single province, is, in our view, a vulnerability. There may be a fire, there may be a natural disaster, with implications across the world for the solar PV penetration in the economies. And the fourth and the last point I wanted to mention that the diversification is good, but it cannot happen itself. Governments need to put together targeted policy efforts, and here, of course, a key issue is how to bring the cost down to attract the investment. When we look at the cost analysis of the solar PV manufacturing, about 40% of the costs are electricity costs. And in China, in most of the provinces where the manufacturing capacity is installed, the electricity prices in China are about 30% lower than global averages. China has a major advantage here. Also, the labor cost is significantly cheaper. So therefore, there is a need to have a competitive edge vis-a-vis the Chinese manufacturing capacity today. Countries need to have creative policies putting together. This may go from providing tax incentives for the manufacturing capacity. We have seen a lot of support for solar PV penetration in the countries for the installation of solar PVs, but for the manufacturing capacity, tax incentives from this to providing, creating incentives of building manufacturing capacity in the industrial clusters in the countries in order to reduce the land costs. So you will see at the end of our report, we came up with 5 categories of concrete policy recommendations to governments so that we can have, on one hand, a major, strong penetration of solar PV, and at the same time, the manufacturing capacity is safe, secure, and sustainable. With these words, I would like to turn my colleague, Mr. Bahar, to take us through some of the key findings, other key findings of our study.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, and welcome everybody. I would like to start with Dr. Birol mentioned that it's a multiple stage process to produce modules. Many of us see just the end panel and we enjoy clean electricity out of this panel, but the process starts with raw materials and especially silicon-based raw materials that we have today. And these stages from polysilicon, ingot, wafer cells to modules have different geographical distributions, have different energy requirements, have different subcategories of main industries such as semiconductors and chemicals, and they are produced in this order in order to achieve the multiple solar PV panel products. And I will be referring to this process throughout my presentation because, as our executive director mentioned, we looked at them in detail, and it's important especially for the diversification and for the supply security implications. China currently dominates the global solar PV supply chains, and this was a long story of China's policies to identify solar PV sector as a priority and as a strategic industry in their economic programs. Chinese manufacturing story started without demand was in China. It was an export-driven industry 10 years ago, and at the time, China's share in multiple processes of manufacturing was already around 50%. However, in the last 10 years, we saw an important shift of Chinese production expanding much faster than any other country or region, and making right now up to 95% of the manufacturing capacity for one segment, which is wafers. I would like to highlight polysilicon and wafers repetitively, because without those, there are no solar PV panels. They are the building blocks or main pillars of this industry, and they basically are very important for the production of solar PV. What happened over the last 10 years is first an incredible economies of scale, thanks to expanding manufacturing capacity, mostly in China, an incredible innovation of the efficiency of the solar PV panels, and this led into a cost reduction and about 80% over the last years, that around the world all the countries have been installing very competitive solar PV panels. Indeed, solar PV has become, in many countries in the world, the cheapest source of electricity generation. Today, China accounts about 50% of the global demand, but at the same time, much larger share of the global production. And electricity, as Dr. Birol said, is an important source of costs, an important source of input into the global solar PV production, especially for polysilicon and wafers, where electricity can be up to 40% of their input. This is very important to highlight, and we looked at a provincial detail of where the projects are manufactured, where the panels are manufactured, and where all the processes are done. And then we basically compare this with the global electricity generation that we have to wait in the entire world. And today, about 60% of global electricity generation is coming from fossil fuels. For solar PV manufacturing, the share of fossil fuels are similar. However, the share of coal is higher. The reason why the share of coal is higher, because of the provinces where the solar PV is manufactured currently, and the locations in some of the Southeast Asian countries, including China, is basically making the share of coal a bit higher. However, despite the share of fossil fuel use, when we talk about the lifetime of the solar PV panel, which is 30 years, we are not talking about years, but just few months to pay back its manufacturing emissions, which shows that it is an environmentally friendly technology. There is energy used in its production in several stages intensively. However, when it comes to generating renewable energy and payback for this energy, solar PV is one of the best technologies, because it pays back in most of the countries in the world in just 5 months. Solar PV is not a small industry in the world right now, and for several countries is a huge economic benefit. Last year, about 50% of all manufactured solar PV panels were traded, and most of the trading good is modules, because they are the most value-added and complete product that most of the countries are buying, mainly from China. However, we saw an important increase in the trade volume over the last years. This is partly due to the volume increase, partly due to the increasing price of solar PV panels due to higher raw material prices. We saw an important jump, and it's about right now $40 billion, and it be expected to increase to almost $50 billion as a trade value globally. And obviously, China and Southeast Asian countries are taking the largest share of this as exporters. Meanwhile, European Union, United States, and India has in big trade deficit compared to solar PV panels, which is about 20 billion. Looking at the value of the trade over the last 5 years, China generated about $80 billion from sales of solar PV panels, 30 billion only last year. But Malaysia and Vietnam and several other Southeast Asian countries are increasingly exporting and using this as an industrial power. We also looked at the contribution of solar PV export to the economy because in the end, jobs and revenues are critical for the countries, especially providing policies to industries. And we see that the contribution is not small, and in China it is about 70% of the trade surplus, which is equal to entire aluminium exports of China, actually. It's a very, also a big industry. And Malaysia is even higher. The contribution is about 10% and about 5% in Vietnam. This tells us an important story about economic value and what can diversification can bring to the economies. However, we see an important situation in the supply chains, which is concentration. And the concentration of different segments of production of solar PV are different and vary. But we expect that two main building blocks, such as polysilicon and wafers, by 2025 will be produced above 95% in a single country. Regardless of country or the region, it is important to highlight this as an upcoming vulnerability in the supply chains for any industry, but specifically here we are talking about solar PV. And we looked at the concentration not only at the country level, but at the sub-regional level. In addition, we also look at the plant level. And I would like to show you the plant level concentration, which actually had several impacts in the prices and demand and supply of the solar PV globally. In the plant level, these two building blocks of the solar PV supply chain, one single plant currently accounts for 15% of global production. As our executive director mentioned, any type of natural disaster or a fire basically can affect the supply and the prices of the solar PV products today. However, there is an important opportunity because towards going to net zero, we will have a lot of new manufacturing capacity needed in order to meet quadrupling demand in just 8 years. In addition to that, this will mean that there will be 120 billion additional investment needed for manufacturing of solar PV. And of course, we are looking at a lot of manufacturing jobs to be created, which is very important for countries, especially in this current economic situation. In that sense, this creates an incredible momentum for countries who are willing to provide policies for diversification because benefits are huge. Economic benefits, jobs benefits, investment benefits, and hopefully export benefits are huge. But there is a big challenge. The big challenge is the cost competitiveness. In order to be competitive with current manufacturing centers, China and Southeast Asia, it is important to look at the cost differentials. And the big cost differential here is between China, Southeast Asia, and other countries, which can be up to 35%. It is important to highlight that the difference is energy, labor costs, but also investment costs. In order to reduce these costs, policies are critical, and this explains our main message about without policies, seeing diversification will be a little bit tough. And we would like to remind that the reason why China is the center of the currently the production is because the policy strategy that China took over the last decade. Some policy action areas and recommendations from the IEA for a secure supply chain of solar PV. First of all, the magic word that Dr. Birol used, diversify. For any industry that has such concentration, diversification from the raw materials and manufacturing is important. So far, many countries have focused on the demand side policies, auctions, feed-in tariffs, and getting the solar PV plants up and running to decarbonize their energy mix. However, we suggest that supply should be into the consideration as well. It should be part of the integral thinking of the advancing clean energy transitions. That's why thinking about supply and manufacturing will be important for solar PV, especially considering its huge role in the upcoming years for the clean energy transitions. The second one, it doesn't happen by itself. We need some policies to de-risk manufacturing investment, as cost competitiveness is difficult with several countries in the world due to their scale that they achieve today. Policies such as finance and tax policies and other de-risking measures will be critical to achieve the diversification. Environmental benefits, which I talked about, they are very important, but there is also room for rapidly reduced manufacturing emissions of solar PV, and creating an environment through diversification can bring this additional benefit, and social and environmental sustainability should be at the heart of government policies. Solar PV is a story of innovation, with its efficiency increasing extremely over the last decade, and we need to continue foster innovation, and this will only happen with funds supporting public and private industries in order to increase cell conversion efficiency and reduced raw materials. And last, the panels have 25 to 30 years lifetimes, and in the end, they are basically a product that needs to be looked after. And there is a great opportunity for recycling and reusing the materials that is in solar PV, especially the materials that are critical. I'm thinking here silver, and recovering those valuable and critical minerals and reusing them in the solar PV industry requires a comprehensive regulatory framework related to collection and recycling. And for this, I would like to turn the floor back to Jethro. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We now have some time for questions from journalists. So we invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And please mention your media outlets, your name and media outlet along with your question. We will now take a 2-minute break just for you to send your questions. We'll be right back. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you very much to the journalists for all the questions. We're getting quite a few from around the world. Excellent questions, so we're going to try and cover as many of them as we can in the time we have. The first one concerns solar PV and the clean energy transition. It's a question from Nuran Erkul Kaya from Anadolu Agency in Turkey. Do you see any risk that supply chain issues, solar PV, lead to a slowdown in the clean energy transition in the midterm amid the global energy crisis and affect chances of reaching net zero in the long term? I think Mr. Bahar is going to take that question on solar PV and the transition.
Thank you very much. Already some of the vulnerabilities that we mentioned in the world has led to several demand-supply imbalances and price increases for solar PV. Right now there is an important push by countries to basically build more capacity, especially for polysilicon, mainly in China, in order to meet the growing demand. Other than that, the other segments of the manufacturing are basically currently in an oversupplied situation, but some capacity needs to be modernized, and that's why we see an important thing. But I would like to mention an important incident that happened multiple times. Several large manufacturing facilities caught fire since 2020 and has led to changing supply, reduced supply for extended period of time, and then led to the price increases. And currently, when we combine overall supply chain disruptions, specific disruptions in the solar PV supply chain, and the increasing raw material prices, we saw over the last year a lot of delays in the delivery of the panels. Many countries reported that, and that's why it's an important factor to consider in the future for diversification.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bahar. The next question is, the journalist didn't give their name, but it's asking about the China aspect of the report. Has the report elicited any response from China, and does the IEA have any advice or messages for China? I think Dr. Birol is going to respond to this question.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to clarify once again our message that the world should be thankful to China for bringing the cost of solar PV down in a massive way. 80% decline of the cost in the last decade was largely as a result of Chinese industrial policy. But now we are seeing that there are such challenges in terms of a major concentration of manufacturing supply chain in one country, and in some cases within China, in one province, and sometimes in one facility. So therefore, this is country X or Y, doesn't matter. Relying on one single country in such a huge way is risky. It can be a fire, it can be a natural disaster, it can be anything, and this can have major implications for the rest of the world. So therefore, we are always in consultation with our colleagues in China, as China is one of the members of the International Energy Agency family as an associate member. And we are going to make a series of webinars, seminars to countries around the world, and I am sure China will be one of the destinations. Our suggestion to China is, there are a few suggestions in the report, but if I can pick up a few of them, diversify within China the supply chain, not concentrate one single facility or one single province, and also to reducing the electricity sector's carbon intensity is very important in order to bring the solar's environmental benefit much stronger. Therefore, the decarbonization of the power sector will be important, as when you manufacturing the solar supply chain, we use a lot of electricity, and if the electricity is heavily fossil fuel dominated, the net benefits of solar may be somewhat reduced. So these perhaps are the two areas. In addition to those, not for China, but for all the countries around the world, the social sustainability of manufacturing is also important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Birol. The next question comes from India, obviously a major market for the deployment of solar PV. This question is from Indian journalist G. Chandra Shekhar, and it's a question about, well, he asks, for diversification, what about the availability of raw materials? Obviously a key question, and I think Mr. Bahar is going to address that one.
Thank you very much, Jethro. A very important question. As I mentioned, there are a lot of materials and processes involved in the solar PV manufacturing, but main raw material in the current technology is available everywhere, which is the process starts with sand or quartz. That the fact that it's widely available and as a relatively cheap product, it is important. The part which is important is the processing it. That's why we are highlighting at the IEA the silicon part is important for diversification, because that part requires a lot of energy and a lot of constant heating requirements, and it is important to diversify not only assembling modules but also production of the silicon and making polysilicon after that, and following processes. For the other materials, that are involved, obviously they are also coming from energy-intensive industries such as glass, but currently, at least there is no important shortages, although the prices have higher. But also I would like to highlight silver here, because although the material use of silver has been declining per output through innovation in the solar PV industry, it is still an important input. And we expect that if the pace of growth continues like this, despite continuation of improvements, solar PV's consumption of silver could reach 30% in the coming decades, which is a high share for a single industry. So technological innovation remains very, very important in that sense.
Thank you, Mr. Bahar. I think we have time for one more question. This one from Catherine Hours from Agence France Presse. do you see new projects and initiatives happening outside of Asia, in the EU, for example? So that one is going to go to Dr. Birol.
Many thanks. First of all, I should tell you that the solar has started in EU. Lots of subsidies in EU several years ago. EU was the leader when it came to solar industry. EU started very strongly Europe, but afterwards, after a few years, the marathon, if I may say so, EU dropped the ball and China took it over, and today, as we see, leading the marathon. Why I'm saying this is that for the EU or other countries to start the marathon strongly is good, but important thing is that to have the same pace and finish the marathon as a leader here. Nobody remembers who finished the marathon first in the 10-kilometer pace. It is important what is happening after the 42 kilometers. So I am saying this, for example, for the hydrogen. Now Europe has started very strongly, and but of course other countries are moving strongly as well, and there is a healthy competition there. I am very happy to tell you that within the EU, the Renew Europe program, as a response to the Russia invasion of Ukraine, there is a strong plan, a major project of 20 gigawatts, which will give a lifeline of the European solar manufacturing capacity, and also in the United States. You mentioned outside of Asia. I should mention the United States. There are strong policies in place coming to provide incentives for investments for building a strong solar manufacturing capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, and thank you to Mr. Bahar, of course. Thank you to the journalists for your questions, and thank you to everyone following this event live online for your interest in the report. And just to note that the full IEA special report on solar PV global supply chains is available for free on our website, so do please go and explore that report. It's well worth your time. And if any journalists have questions that didn't get answered or covered during the Q&A that we had time for, we do invite you to reach out and follow up with our press office, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. That's all we have time for. Thank you and goodbye.